6 words. That's all it took to freeze the WNBA mid-conversation. No press conference. No interview. No heated rant or public call-out. Just 6 calm, perfectly timed words that quietly shifted the balance of power inside women's basketball. At first, it looked like nothing more than a slick joke. Something fans would laugh at, screenshot, and move on from. But beneath the surface, those 6 words did something far more dangerous. They exposed how much leverage one player actually holds. They revealed how fragile certain alliances really are. And they forced the entire league to confront an uncomfortable truth it had been trying to dance around for years. This wasn't trash talk. This wasn't drama for clicks. And it definitely wasn't accidental. What followed wasn't just backlash or debate. It was a full-on narrative takeover. The kind where one person doesn't need to speak loudly because everyone else does it for them. Where silence becomes strategy. And where timing matters more than volume. Because while the internet was busy arguing about respect, unity, and veteran leadership, Caitlin Clark was doing something far more calculated. She was letting the system expose itself. And the wild part, the real tension didn't start with those 6 words. It started days earlier. Behind smiles, cameras, and matching shirts. At an all-star weekend that was never really about basketball. On the surface, the 2025 WNBA All-Star Weekend looked exactly how the league wanted it to look. Bright lights. Packed arena. Nearly 17,000 fans filling Gainbridge Fieldhouse in Indianapolis. The league's biggest names gathered in one place, celebrating how far women's basketball had come. Highlight reels were ready. Broadcast partners were locked in. Sponsors were watching closely. It was supposed to be a victory lap. But behind the warm-ups and the smiles, the weekend carried a weight that had nothing to do with points, assists, or all-star bragging rights. Because for the players, this weekend wasn't just a celebration. It was leverage. The WNBA's collective bargaining agreement was quietly ticking toward expiration. And the numbers behind the scenes told a story the players were tired of accepting. Despite record growth, rising ratings, and a surge of new fans, WNBA athletes were still receiving only a small fraction of league revenue. A single-digit slice in a league suddenly flush with attention. So the players coordinated. Before tip-off, nearly everyone stepped onto the floor wearing the same message across their chests. Pay us what you owe us. No speeches. No shouting. Just a unified visual that cut through the noise. This wasn't fashion. This was pressure. It was a reminder to owners, executives, and broadcasters that the product on the court had value. Real value. And that the athletes driving the league's sudden momentum expected to be part of the financial upside. For once, the message was clean, unified, and impossible to ignore. And for a brief moment, it worked. Fans applauded the statement. Media praised the solidarity. Analysts framed it as a turning point in labor negotiations. Everything was aligned. Until it wasn't. Because unity only works when everyone stays on script. And it only takes one comment, one unscripted moment, to redirect the entire conversation. That moment came not during the game, not on the court, but in a post-game press conference where the cameras were still rolling and the microphones were still hot. Kelsey Plum, a proven star and a respected veteran, sat at the podium. She wasn't just another player answering routine questions. She was a vice president of the Players Association, a voice of leadership in a moment that demanded precision. When the conversation turned to the protest shirts and the meeting behind them, nobody expected fireworks. This was supposed to be the easy part. Reinforce unity. Emphasize togetherness. Keep the focus on compensation and fairness. Instead, Plum went off script. Almost casually. Almost jokingly. She mentioned that while the players had met and coordinated the message, not to tattletale, 0 members of Team Clark were present. The room changed instantly. Laughter broke out, the awkward kind. Not relief. Not humor. The kind that signals something just went wrong. Sitting beside Plum, Sabrina Ionescu didn't even try to hide it. Her eyes rolled. Her body language stiffened. And when she fired back with a dry, sarcastic response that really needed to be mentioned, it was clear she knew exactly what had just happened. A moment designed to spotlight collective power had been hijacked by a comment that pointed fingers at the league's most visible star. And here's what made it explosive. Caitlin Clark wasn't just another all-star. She wasn't just a rookie. She wasn't even playing that night. She wasn't there at all. Not because she didn't care. Not because she skipped out. But because she was home, recovering from a groin injury that had already sidelined her from games. That detail mattered. A lot. But once the comment was out, context didn't stand a chance. The narrative had shifted. What was meant to be a unified stand for better pay instantly turned into a question of loyalty, of effort, of whether the league's biggest draw was truly with the rest of the players or quietly above it all. And that's when the tension beneath the WNBA's rapid growth finally surfaced. Because in that one moment, the league wasn't just talking about labor anymore. It was confronting something far more uncomfortable: power, visibility, and resentment. And while the room laughed nervously and cameras kept rolling, one thing became clear. This weekend wasn't about basketball anymore. And what happened next would only make that reality impossible to ignore. What made Kelsey Plum's comment so dangerous wasn't just what she said. It was where she said it, when she said it, and who she was when she said it. This wasn't a locker room joke. This wasn't a private moment caught on a hot mic. This was a post-game press conference during the most visible weekend of the WNBA season. Every camera was live. Every quote was getting clipped. Every word mattered. And Plum knew that. As a veteran star and a leader within the Players Association, her role in that moment wasn't just to answer questions. It was to protect the message. The shirts, the unity, the leverage. That's what leadership looks like during labor moments. You don't fracture the optics. You don't create side narratives. You definitely don't single out names. Yet that's exactly what happened. The phrase "not to tattletale" did more damage than people realized in real time, because it framed the comment as playful while doing the opposite. It positioned Clark, without saying her name directly, as someone who didn't show up, someone who wasn't aligned, someone potentially benefiting from the movement without participating in it. And in a league already hypersensitive to hierarchy and recognition, that implication landed like gasoline. The reaction inside the room said everything. There was no applause, no nodding agreement, just an uneasy pause and a forced laugh that felt more like a reflex than approval. Sabrina Ionescu's response wasn't dramatic, but it was surgical. That eye roll, that deadpan sarcasm. It was the reaction of someone who instantly understood the consequences. She knew the headline had just been written, and it wasn't going to be about player compensation anymore. Because the media doesn't chase unity. It chases friction. And Plum had just handed it friction on a silver platter. Within minutes, clips of the exchange were circulating online. Not the shirts. Not the numbers. Not the revenue split. Just that line. Just that implication. Just that moment where a veteran appeared to call out the league's most talked-about player without ever fully committing to the accusation. That ambiguity was the problem. If Plum had gone all the way, if she had directly criticized Clark, it would have been confrontational but clear. Instead, the half-joking delivery created plausible deniability while still planting the seed. And once that seed was planted, it didn't need watering. The internet did the rest. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't about underpaid athletes fighting for fair compensation. It was about whether Caitlin Clark was really part of the movement. About whether her fame had distanced her from the grind the veterans had endured for years. About whether she was benefiting from the spotlight without sharing the burden. And all of that stemmed from one offhand line that never needed to be said. But the most important part? Clark still hadn't responded. Not publicly. Not privately. Not at all. And that silence wasn't accidental. The problem with insinuations is that they crumble the moment facts enter the room. Caitlin Clark wasn't missing. She wasn't absent by choice. She wasn't dodging responsibility. She was injured. A groin issue had already forced her out of games in mid-July. The team had been transparent about it. Medical updates were public. She wasn't even in Indianapolis. She was home, rehabbing, doing exactly what franchises expect star players to do when their bodies say stop. So the idea that she somehow skipped a meeting to avoid showing support didn't just feel unfair. It felt disconnected from reality. And fans noticed immediately. This wasn't some obscure role player being questioned. This was the same athlete who had transformed the league's visibility in a matter of months. The same player whose games were breaking viewership records. The same name driving ticket prices up across the country. The same rookie whose arrival forced mainstream sports media to finally take women's basketball seriously on a nightly basis. That context mattered. Because even without attending a single meeting, Clark had already done more to strengthen the player's negotiating position than any coordinated statement ever could. Revenue follows attention. Leverage follows revenue. And Clark was the epicenter of both. Since her debut, television ratings didn't just rise, they exploded. Networks scrambled to flex her games into better time slots. Arenas that used to struggle to fill lower bowls were suddenly selling out. Merchandise with her name became scarce. Expansion fees surged as investors realized the league wasn't just growing, it was becoming profitable. All of that changed the math. And everyone inside the league knew it. So when Plum's comment suggested Clark wasn't present, fans pushed back hard. Because presence isn't just physical. It's economic. It's cultural. It's about who moves the needle when the lights come on. And Clark had been moving it relentlessly. That's why the backlash wasn't subtle. Social media didn't debate. It picked sides. Comment sections filled with accusations of jealousy, poor timing, and misdirected frustration. Analysts questioned why anyone would publicly undercut the league's most valuable asset during a critical labor moment. Even casual fans, new to the WNBA, sensed the contradiction immediately. Why attack the player bringing the money to the table? Why fracture unity right when leverage was peaking? And why do it knowing she couldn't even defend herself from the room? That's when the dynamic shifted completely. What initially looked like a veteran asserting leadership began to look like insecurity. What sounded like a joke began to feel like resentment leaking through the cracks. And what could have been a minor footnote became the center of the conversation, exactly what labor movements try to avoid. Still, Caitlin Clark didn't respond. She didn't post a clarification. She didn't defend her absence. She didn't correct the narrative. Instead, she let the noise grow. And in doing so, she set the stage for what would become the most surgical response of the entire saga. One that would land harder precisely because she waited. Because while everyone else was arguing, she was watching. And the opportunity was about to present itself. Caitlin Clark never needed to enter the conversation. That's the part most people missed. The moment Plum's comment escaped the room, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming, and it didn't require Clark to lift a finger. Sports fans, analysts, commentators, and even casual viewers who had only recently started paying attention to the WNBA all reached the same conclusion at roughly the same time. This didn't look like leadership. It didn't look like unity. And it definitely didn't look strategic. The backlash wasn't driven by die-hard Clark fans alone. It came from people who understood media dynamics. From analysts who recognized how rare it is for a single athlete to shift an entire league's economic outlook. From commentators who knew that public perception matters more than internal frustration, especially during labor negotiations. Clips of the press conference spread faster than the league could react. Not because they were explosive, but because they were uncomfortable. Sabrina Ionescu's reaction became its own storyline. The eye roll, the body language, the clear signal that even within the room, the comment felt unnecessary. That single visual did more to shape public interpretation than any follow-up explanation could have. And Clark, she stayed completely silent. No defensive post. No clarification. No, just setting the record straight. That silence did two things at once. First, it denied the controversy oxygen. Without a back and forth, the story stayed one-sided. And one-sided stories tend to tilt toward the person who looks wronged rather than the person doing the explaining. Second, it forced everyone else to speak on her behalf. Fans defended her. Analysts contextualized her absence. Commentators reframed the issue as misdirected resentment. By the time mainstream sports shows picked it up, the angle was already set. Why would anyone undermine the league's most valuable draw during a critical labor moment? Why create a rift when momentum was finally on the players' side? The conversation stopped being about whether Clark attended a meeting. It became about why someone would even bring it up. And the longer Clark remained quiet, the clearer her strategy became. Engaging too early would have made her look defensive. It would have validated the idea that she owed an explanation. It would have kept the spotlight on a moment that benefited no one. Instead, she let the internet do what it always does when given a clear imbalance. It amplified the side that looked reasonable. While the debate raged, Clark focused on recovery, on preparation, on letting her on-court impact continue speaking for itself. And that restraint mattered. Because when you respond too quickly, you react. When you wait, you choose. And Clark was waiting for the right moment. The opportunity didn't come through an interview. It didn't come through a press release. It didn't even come through basketball. It came through Instagram. A day after the press conference, Kelsey Plum posted a carousel celebrating All-Star Weekend. Smiling photos. Team moments. A simple caption that read like closure. What a weekend. To most people scrolling by, it was nothing. Just another athlete post. Another recap. Another moment that would disappear into the feed. But Caitlin Clark noticed something Plum didn't. In the background of one of the photos sat a massive Nike logo. Clean. Unavoidable. Front and center. That detail mattered. Not because of branding aesthetics, but because of business reality. Plum wasn't a Nike athlete anymore. She had switched to Under Armour years earlier, debuting her own signature colorway and aligning herself with a different brand identity. Nike, on the other hand, had gone all in on Clark. Clark wasn't just sponsored by Nike. She was positioned as the face of the next era. A long-term investment. A cornerstone. A player whose name moved product in ways the league hadn't seen before. And in that moment, Plum had unknowingly given Clark a perfect opening. No confrontation. No insults. No escalation. Just irony. Clark didn't rush it. She didn't pile on. She didn't add emojis or exclamation points. She didn't even tag anyone. She responded with 6 words. Thank you for the Nike ad. That was it. No explanation. No context. No follow-up. And the effect was immediate. Screenshots flooded timelines. Sports blogs dissected it. Podcasts replayed it. Fans argued over whether it was petty or brilliant. But everyone agreed on one thing. It landed. Because those 6 words weren't just a joke. They were layered. On the surface, it was playful. Underneath, it was branding dominance. And at its core, it was a reminder of who actually controlled attention in that moment. Clark didn't mention meetings. She didn't mention injuries. She didn't mention the comment at all. She reframed the entire narrative with a single observation that highlighted the one thing nobody could argue against, her market power. And in doing so, she didn't just respond. She ended the conversation. What made Caitlin Clark's response devastating wasn't sarcasm. It wasn't shade. It wasn't even confidence. It was precision. Those 6 words worked because they didn't argue with anyone. They didn't correct anyone. They didn't even acknowledge the controversy directly. Instead, they reframed the entire situation in a way that made further debate feel pointless. Thank you for the Nike ad. Read plainly, it sounds casual. Almost throwaway. Something you could scroll past without stopping. But context turned it into something much heavier. First, it subtly shifted the focus from feelings to economics. Not unity. Not loyalty. Not meetings. Money. Branding. Visibility. The stuff leagues quietly revolve around, but rarely say out loud. Second, it reminded everyone, without listing achievements or citing numbers, that Clark wasn't just a player inside the system. She was a force shaping it. Nike didn't build campaigns around accidents. They didn't center marketing machines around people who didn't move the needle. And they definitely didn't let stars accidentally dominate visual space. Third, it exposed an imbalance Plum couldn't address without making things worse. If Plum responded emotionally, she looked rattled. If she responded analytically, she acknowledged the power gap. If she ignored it, the silence spoke for her. That's why the internet didn't debate whether Clark was right. It debated whether the response was genius. Because genius responses don't escalate. They conclude. Clark never said she was more important. She never claimed superiority. She never even referenced the earlier comment. She let implication do the work. And implication is far harder to fight than accusation. In one move, she reminded fans, sponsors, executives, and players that influence in modern sports isn't just earned on the court. It's earned in boardrooms, broadcast schedules, and brand meetings that most athletes never get invited into. That realization made people uncomfortable, especially those who had spent years grinding without recognition. But discomfort doesn't make something untrue. And Clark understood that. Once those 6 words landed, the board flipped. Kelsey Plum wasn't facing Caitlin Clark anymore. She was facing optics. Any response she considered carried risk. If she clapped back, she looked petty, confirming the very insecurity fans were accusing her of. If she defended herself, she extended a story that had already turned against her. If she stayed silent, the moment calcified. And that's exactly what happened. Plum went quiet. No follow-up post. No clarification. No, that wasn't what I meant. Days passed. Then weeks. And during that time, the narrative settled. The story wasn't framed as rivalry. It wasn't framed as beef. It was framed as outplayed. Not on the court, but in awareness. Clark's response didn't just end the exchange. It made any further engagement feel beneath her. And that's the kind of imbalance that's impossible to ignore once it's visible. Every time the clip resurfaced, it landed the same way. Every replay reinforced the same takeaway. Timing beat volume. Restraint beat reaction. Silence beat explanation. Plum knew it too. Because when someone wins without raising their voice, the loss feels permanent. And the longer she waited, the harder it became to re-enter the conversation without reopening wounds she couldn't heal publicly. That's the danger of modern visibility. Once perception locks in, correcting it takes more than words. It takes time, distance, and usually an explanation framed as regret rather than defense. Which is exactly where this story was headed next. Because eventually, Plum would speak again. Not in a press conference, not in a post-game setting, but in a controlled space where tone could soften and damage control could begin. And when she did, it confirmed something most people already suspected. This was never supposed to become what it became. Nearly a month passed before Kelsey Plum finally spoke. Not in front of reporters. Not courtside. Not with cameras stacked 3 deep. She chose a podcast. A familiar voice. A controlled environment. Appearing on Sue Bird's show, Plum addressed the situation for the first time since the internet had already rendered its verdict. And from the moment she began explaining herself, one thing became clear. This wasn't clarification. It was containment. Plum described her comment as a joke. A bad one. A moment that didn't land the way she intended. She explained that she was trying to lighten the mood, that it was never meant to single anyone out, and that she regretted how it pulled attention away from the real issue, player compensation. On the surface, it sounded reasonable. Human even. People make mistakes. Words slip. Context gets lost. But the timing told a different story. If the comment had truly been harmless, it wouldn't have required weeks of silence followed by a carefully worded explanation. If the optics hadn't gone sideways, there would have been no need to reframe intent at all. Damage control always arrives late, after perception has already solidified. And by the time Plum spoke, the narrative had moved past her explanation. The question was no longer what she meant. It was why it happened in the first place. Why did frustration surface in that moment? Why aim sideways during a labor push? Why let personal tension bleed into a collective effort? Plum emphasized unity. She reiterated support for Clark. She stressed that everyone wore the shirts and believed in the cause. But explanations don't rewind impact. The story had already revealed something deeper, something far more uncomfortable than a bad joke. This was never really about a meeting. It was about visibility. For years, WNBA veterans carried the league through empty arenas, limited coverage, and financial uncertainty. They played elite basketball without mainstream attention. They built the foundation without ever getting the spotlight they deserved. Then Caitlin Clark arrived, and everything accelerated. Suddenly, games were national events. Suddenly, casual fans cared. Suddenly, money showed up. That kind of shift creates opportunity, but it also creates tension. Because when one player becomes the engine of growth, it forces everyone else to confront a reality they didn't choose. Attention isn't evenly distributed. Neither is influence. And in modern sports, influence is power. Clark didn't take anything from veterans. She changed the scale. But scale changes hierarchies. That's where resentment can creep in, quietly, unintentionally, and then all at once. Not because veterans aren't great. Not because they didn't earn respect. But because timing isn't fair. Some players grind for years. Others arrive at the perfect moment. Clark happened to arrive when the league was ready, and the world was watching. That doesn't make her the enemy. It makes her unavoidable. And the uncomfortable truth is this. Every player benefits from her presence, whether they admit it or not. Better TV deals. Higher caps. Improved travel. More investment. More kids watching. More leverage at the bargaining table. That's not opinion. That's economics. So when frustration gets aimed at the very player driving that leverage, it weakens the entire movement. It fractures unity right when unity matters most. Clark seems to understand that instinctively. She doesn't posture. She doesn't overreact. She doesn't demand credit. She plays the long game. And that's why this moment lingered. Because it exposed a league in transition, from survival to relevance, from anonymity to scrutiny, from equality and obscurity to hierarchy and visibility. That shift is messy. It creates friction. and it forces everyone to adapt. The question isn't whether Caitlin Clark belongs at the center of this new era. She already is. The question is who else learns how to operate in a league where one player can shape narratives without raising her voice, and whether the WNBA can grow without letting internal tensions slow its momentum. Because this wasn't just a clapback. It was a warning, and it showed exactly how power works now. By the time the noise finally died down, something irreversible had already happened. The league had seen itself clearly. Not through numbers, not through press releases, but through behavior. What this moment ultimately revealed wasn't who won an exchange or who said the sharper line. It revealed how power now moves inside women's basketball, quietly, strategically, and often without asking for permission. Caitlin Clark didn't dominate this moment by talking more. She dominated it by understanding the environment she was operating in. She understood that in a league finally experiencing real momentum, perception travels faster than facts. That once a narrative catches fire, the smartest move isn't to throw more fuel on it. It's to redirect the wind. She waited. She watched. She chose. And when she spoke, she didn't argue the past. She pointed to the present. That's what separates reaction from control. Clark never claimed to be the face of the league. She never demanded special treatment. She never said she was more important than anyone else. She simply behaved like someone who knew exactly how much weight her presence carried, and how little effort it took to remind everyone else of it. That's why the 6 words worked. They didn't embarrass anyone publicly. They didn't attack character. They didn't fracture relationships beyond repair. They ended the conversation without escalating it. And that's rare. For Kelsey Plum, this moment will likely fade with time. She's too talented, too accomplished, and too respected to be defined by one misstep. Her explanation didn't make her a villain, it made her human. A veteran navigating a league that changed faster than anyone expected. But moments like this don't disappear. They linger as reference points. They become lessons, especially for a league entering a new phase of visibility where every comment, every look, every pause is magnified. The WNBA isn't fighting for attention anymore. It has it. Now it has to learn how to live with it. That means understanding that star power doesn't erase collective struggle, it amplifies it. That unity doesn't mean sameness. And that resentment, when aimed at the wrong target, can quietly undermine progress. Caitlin Clark didn't just survive this moment. She defined it. Not because she wanted to, but because the system responded to her presence whether she spoke or not. That's the future the league is stepping into. A future where influence isn't loud, where timing matters more than outrage, where silence, when used correctly, speaks louder than any press conference ever could. And if this is only the beginning, if one player can shift narratives, reshape economics, and expose tensions without raising her voice, then the real question isn't what Caitlin Clark will do next. It's how everyone else will adapt to a league where power no longer announces itself. Because the spotlight isn't going anywhere, and neither is she. What made this moment linger wasn't outrage. It was how quickly everything went quiet. No follow-up drama. No rematch trash talk. No escalating back and forth. Just a subtle shift in how Caitlin Clark was talked about. After the Nike comment, the tone around her changed. Not louder, sharper. Analysts stopped framing her as the rookie phenomenon and started treating her like an operator. Someone who understood the business, the media, and the politics surrounding the game as well as the game itself. That's a dangerous transition for a league still adjusting to visibility. Because once a player is seen as aware, expectations change. Every interview becomes scrutinized. Every silence becomes intentional. Every smile gets interpreted. Clark didn't just raise the bar for rookies. She quietly raised it for stars. Veterans watching this unfold didn't miss the lesson either. You could feel it in later press conferences. The wording tightened. The jokes disappeared. The league-wide tone became more cautious, more measured. Not because anyone was scared, but because they understood the environment had shifted. This was no longer a league operating in relative obscurity where comments vanished overnight. This was a league where moments crystallized. And Clark had just demonstrated how quickly one moment could become permanent. Years from now, this won't be remembered as a clapback. It'll be remembered as a turning point. The moment the WNBA crossed into a new era, where individual gravity could bend the entire conversation without confrontation. This is how modern sports power works now. Not through dominance alone, not through aggression, but through alignment with attention, capital, and timing. Clark didn't create the tension between veterans and new stars. That tension exists in every league that evolves fast. What she did was expose it, unintentionally, but unmistakably. She showed that silence can be strategy, humor can be leverage, branding can end arguments, and influence doesn't need permission. That's uncomfortable for systems built on hierarchy and seniority. But it's also inevitable, because leagues don't grow linearly. They spike. And when they spike, someone becomes the focal point, whether they ask for it or not. Clark didn't demand that role. She absorbed it. And by doing so, she forced the league to mature faster than it planned to. That's why this moment mattered more than a meeting, more than a comment, more than a joke. It was a stress test, and the league passed barely. If you want breakdowns that go beyond headlines, past the viral clips, and into what's really shaping the future of basketball, make sure you're subscribed. This is where the stories don't stop when the tweet ends. They start. You're not going to want to miss what comes next.